And with us to talk about it, he's the head of the School of History at Queen Mary University of London. Julian Jackson is the author of A Certain Idea of France, The Life of Charles de Gaulle. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
In your book, you make it quite clear, and because, well, it's a very, how should I say this, a very British take on General de Gaulle. No Churchill, no de Gaulle.
Yes, I think most French people would actually agree with that. They quarreled later, but I think de Gaulle himself would have accepted that without Churchill's help, he would have been nowhere. So, as you said as the little introduction said, he arrived in London on the 17th of June, 1940, and he really wasn't a well-known person. He was the most junior general in the French army. He had been briefly a member of the last government of the defunct Third Republic, but in a very junior capacity. So he wasn't a particularly well-known person. And what made him eventually known was the fact that he had the BBC at his disposal. Without the BBC, he would originally have been nothing. And who's the man who said to him that he could make the broadcast which we're remembering and celebrating today? It was Winston Churchill.
Churchill, who had to defend de Gaulle against members of his own cabinet.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And although, as I said a moment ago, and everybody knows, Churchill and de Gaulle quarreled terribly later on, at the beginning, Churchill was his firmest supporter in London. And the reason why the cabinet was skeptical and not keen to allow this unknown person to speak was because of the situation in France. You've just got to remember what things were like in France. The very venerable war hero Marshal Pétain had just taken over the government, and an armistice with Germany had not yet been signed. And the British were really worried what the terms of that armistice might be. Would the French fleet, for example, fall into the hands of the Germans? So on the 18th of June, the last thing members of the British government want to do is to alienate Marshal Pétain's government while not knowing what it's going to do, because they're desperate that Pétain, as it were, preserves the fleet and possibly even decides to reject terms that would be unacceptable. So why give the airwaves to a man who is basically about to condemn Pétain? So what Churchill did was an act of really of impulse, really, and a kind of sort of a leap into the dark, whereas members of the government were saying, no, wait, let's not provoke Pétain. So that's the reason why the government was skeptical. It wasn't that they disliked de Gaulle, they didn't really know who he was. It was they wanted to play a slightly more complicated game.
And he bets on this, well, let's put it bluntly, a fractious character. De Gaulle, he's this military officer. His formative years are World War I. In the 1920s, he soaks in Paris intellectual life, and he becomes a magnet to politics.
Yes, he starts in the 1930s to see himself as having a kind of national destiny, really. He's one of those people, like Churchill, actually, who long before, as it were, the call comes in 1940 for both of them, have been a bit outsiders in very different ways. They're outsiders. And de Gaulle became increasingly impatient with the planning of the military and increasingly impatient with the whole sort of nature of French politics in the 1930s. So he is a sort of outsider, and some people think, oh, he's a maverick, he's dangerous, and so on. And that was another of his problems when he came to London. Who is he? What does he actually think? Is he very right-wing? Is he, some people suspected, a fascist? That was certainly not in any case way the truth, but people didn't know anything about this man. I can't really repeat too much that even the French didn't. And for at least the first 2 years of the war, he's mainly just a voice. They hear this voice, and this voice who gives them hope. And part of his attraction, in fact, is that they don't really know exactly what he represents, except this idea, we have not been defeated, the war is not over, we must resist the Germans, all the things that we know. And it was precisely because people didn't know other things about him that they could almost see him like a blank sheet onto whom they could write their expectations and their hopes for the future.
Yeah, it became one of his stock phrases, a certain idea of France. Now, when Charles de Gaulle returns to power in 1958, there's that bitter divide over Algeria's War of Independence. It brings France to the brink of civil war. He gets Parliament to give him a mandate to scrap the Constitution and write a new one. And as we're about to hear, journalists wonder aloud if it's a coup. Yes, is it at the age of 67, he says, that I'm going to start a career as a dictator? Fast forward to 2019, Julian Jackson, and when you hear France's now president, Emmanuel Macron, talk about a Jupiterian presidency, is he the inheritor of de Gaulle?
Well, I think that's a good and complicated question. I don't know whether you've seen the official photograph, the Élysée photograph. Every French president has themselves photographed where the photograph would be up in all town halls and so on. And Macron's photograph has him standing in the Élysée in front of a table. He's back to the table, and behind him there's a book open, and the book open is the war memoirs of Charles de Gaulle. So quite clearly Macron is signaling something there about an admiration, but perhaps also about an inspiration. And the constitution of which Macron is now the president was the constitution that de Gaulle created between 58 and 62. And actually, you're absolutely right to say he came back in 58 in slightly complicated circumstances as a result of a military uprising in Algeria. But the really key event was when in 1962, de Gaulle created what was at the time a political revolution in France. He said that in future, the president of the Republic will be elected by universal suffrage. So he will have a great popular legitimacy that no previous president in France had had. And
a place which
gives
is
the...
I was going to say, and it gives the French a unique form of government in Western Europe. Julian Jackson, the chapters devoted to de Gaulle's presidency, absolutely fascinating in your book, A Certain Idea of France, The Life of Charles de Gaulle. Thank you for speaking with us from London.
Thank you.